Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maura McGinty-Kloss. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications for the Natural Areas Association, and you're joining us for the US National and International Vegetation Classification Hierarchy 3.0, alignment with the IUCN and application for swaps. And I would like to just take a moment to thank the Bureau of Land Management for generously supporting NAA and helping us to continue to provide great content for land management practitioners. For those of you who are new to the National Areas Association, we're a national nonprofit organization that serves those who steward the land to protect biodiversity. Our mission is to get quality science and best practices into the hands of those who can make an impact on the ground by shared applied science, practical solutions, and new knowledge through both in-person and digital opportunities. NAA's digital content includes symposia, webinars, videos, and we release new content on our YouTube channel every Friday at 11. We also publish the Natural Areas Journal quarterly and distribute the Natural Areas News twice a month, which is freely available in your inbox. NAA is available wherever you are located, wherever you are in your career, wherever you are in your practice, and whenever you have time. If you'd like to learn more about the NAA, please feel free to take a photo of this QR code or come to naturalareas.org. Just a quick heads up about two webinars that are coming up in January. January 25th, we have Research and Management of the Invasive Hemlock Woolly Adelgid, the ongoing effort to save hemlock forests in the eastern US and Canada. And then in February, integrating climate change into invasive plant policy and management. And now, before I introduce our speakers and we get to today's content, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping items. Some of you may have already turned on captions. That's great. And if you still wish to do so, you can go to Show Captions, which is located on the Zoom navigation bar. We encourage you to participate in today's sessions. Please post comments or shared resources in chat. And if you have any questions, please post those in Q&A, and we'll address as many as we can after the presentation. Please know that this program is being recorded, and everyone registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link in about a week. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers. Don Faber Langendoen is a senior ecologist with the NatureServe and serves as editor-in-chief for the Ecological Society of America's USNVC Peer Review Board and co-chairs the Canadian NVC Committee. He has collaborated with state, federal agency, and international partners on standardized methods for classifying the diversity of ecosystems through the International Vegetation Classification and assessing their conservation status and ecological integrity. He will be joined today by his colleague, Patrick McIntyre, who is the Director of Ecology at NatureServe and serves on the USNVC Steering Committee. Patrick's areas of focus include the effects of climate change on forest ecosystems, classifying and mapping ecosystems, and improving the availability of biodiversity data for conservation and decision-making. So at this point, Don, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you begin your presentation.
Thanks so much, Moira. And greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining our presentation today. We want to give you a bit of a preview. Version 3.0 is not out yet, but we are closing in on a release early next spring. So this is a little bit of a heads up to what's coming. Just a brief outline, we'll talk about the partnerships involved, some of the basics of the classification. We'll then look into some detail at the hierarchy structure, particularly in combination with the International Vegetation Classification and the global ecosystem typology. Then we'll get back to the nitty-gritty of how we describe types and collect data for them and the peer review process before I'll then pass it over to Patrick to look at applications and some of the state wildlife action plan applications. With that, the NVC has long been based on a strong partnership between that's under the umbrella of the Federal Geographic Data Committee Vegetation Subcommittee. And the U.S. Forest Service chairs that subcommittee. And it's a subcommittee that then serves as the federal structure for the partnership, which involves a number of federal agencies. U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Geological Survey are the strong signatories on the MOU between the partners, with NatureServe and the Ecological Society of America being the non-federal partners. So the very basics of the NVC 3.0, it is an inventory of all terrestrial realm ecosystems. When we think about ecosystems around the globe, it is common to think of them in terms of the major realms: the terrestrial, the freshwater, the marine, and the subterranean. The USNVC focuses on the terrestrial, but includes that transitional terrestrial area of overlap with the other realms on the wetland side. The freshwater wetlands and coastal marine, salt marsh, mangrove wetlands are also included in the NVC. And we extend the NVC across all terrestrial ecosystems, whether managed anthropogenic ecosystems, but we focus primarily on the natural ecosystems. And because it's a terrestrial classification, vegetation is a strong driver, so hence the USNVC, even though it's a vegetation classification, represents, if you will, a viewpoint on terrestrial ecosystems. By keeping our scope focused on the terrestrial, including the overlap, we're in a better position now with the NVC to understand how it relates to other federal standards. The National Wetland Standard, implemented through the National Wetland Inventory, is one such classification, and then the Coastal Marine Ecological Classification Standard is the other. And through this realms approach, we can see both those distinctive parts of these standards as well as the area of overlap. And perhaps someday we'll get together and talk more carefully about how we actually deal with that area of overlap. Just very briefly on the history of the NVC, because we've been at it for a while. The first standard was released in 1997, publication in 98, and the classification structure was heavily, or the classification approach was heavily based on vegetation structure. But here you see sort of a nitpicky way of working through physiognomy, and that's what we use to organize the vegetation. It created trouble for all the variation that actually occurs with vegetation structure. For example, exactly where do saguaros go? And so we ended up needing to go back to the drawing board, think more carefully about vegetation pattern in relation to ecosystems. But before I talk more about that, I just want to mention that broadly speaking, we've been on a longer journey, which really began with the state natural heritage programs, which were initiated in 1974, following the Endangered Species Act. And many programs also wanted to have an ecological classification to assess biodiversity. Ultimately, NatureServe and the federal agencies and the Ecological Society recognized a need that came together in the late 90s to create the first NVC standard. Same time, NatureServe was working internationally, and so we dovetailed our work with the International Vegetation Classification. As you saw, that version 1 was very simple, did not work very well. And so since then, we've been looking to upgrade that. We implemented an interim solution on the NatureServe side called Ecological Systems, which looked at both existing and potential veg. We also initiated partnerships in Canada with the Canadian NVC, and that led to a formal revision of the standard in 2008. But it took us another 8 years to actually implement a set of units that met that standard, and that was released in 2016, and that was version 2. Since then, we've continued to look at how to improve the NVC, and with that, we're now at the point of releasing version 3. So just a very simple contrast in how far we've moved from version 1. you recall the very simple physiognomic structure of version 1, we now have a much more integrated ecological vegetation structure that works with biomes at the highest level. And so now problematic types in the old classification, like saguaros, have a very natural home in a biome called desert and semi-desert. As you can see, the structure again outlines terrestrial biomes, just the core part of that realm, but also then deals with the overlapping freshwater and marine wetlands. So we're excited about this new structure. It's much more ecologically based and is a way to organize the vegetation in a more integrated fashion. So the structure uses biomes at the upper level. Biomes are large-scale ecosystems driven by global patterns of climate physiognomy and disturbances. And we have nested within those subbiomes and ecobiomes or formations, which provide more detailed global ecological patterns in vegetation. At the mid-levels, we then bring in continental to regional floristic information. So floristic is not used above, but is now brought in, along with physiognomy, life history, and ecological criteria. And those work their way down, those criteria work their way down through all the levels, ultimately getting us to the more local levels of alliance and association. The alliance is the more attainable national and international unit. The association is national, but more often subnational in its scope. Not all states at this point have functional association level classifications. So we'll work with them when they're available. That's a bit of a detail on the overall structure. Here's a more pictorial view of those same 8 levels, showing what we call the EcoVeg approach for the USNVC. We call it that approach because the approach itself is used more widely beyond the US. It's the Canadians classification is using it. The IVC, which straddles the globe, uses it. Our Australian partners are using it. And so it's an overall approach that guides the USNVC. We released the global descriptions of all the types back in 2016. And we're now working on a revised version that reflects the biome approach. This biome approach, though, is actually tailored along the lines of the global ecosystem typology, which was released in 2022. NatureServe staff were part of the team that developed that. And as I mentioned earlier, it covers all the realms, whereas the IVC and USNVC just cover the terrestrial. So the global typology is quite a comprehensive classification. And in reworking the USNVC and the EcoVeg approach that undergirds it, we took the units we had, the levels we had in the FGDC standard, which were already moving in a biome direction. We just didn't get all the way there. And so the global typology kind of pushed us all the way through. You can see that there are also mid-levels in the global typology shared with the USNVC structure, and then we actually drill down even further. So it's this realms approach that, on the one hand, we have worked closely with the global typology to refine the USNVC to focus on terrestrial. And within that, then, we have the shared units across the other levels. The NVC has a subbiome level, not in the global typology, but we come back together again at level 3. For the mid-levels, there are no units developed for the global typology. It's quite a demanding task across the globe. But the IVC and the USNVC have long been engaged in working across multiple levels. And so for the IVC, we have levels down to the group across all of the Americas and in Africa, and working with our European partners, the Brown Wall K tradition, we have equivalent units there. So it's quite comprehensive. Alliance and association are less fully developed. So here's just an example of one set of types that go from the broad terrestrial realm into temperate boreal forests, working our way down to oceanic cool temperate rainforests, and ultimately working all the way down to the Portford cedar forest type and its association. So that's the way in which the classification organizes the vegetation. I want to just briefly look more closely at the oceanic cool temperate rainforest. Look across the globe. There are a number of places where this biome occurs. Off the coast of South America, over in Australia and in New Guinea, and then on the North Pacific coast. If we look more closely at how we've been applying this biome concept in North America, here again is the shared set of upper levels. So we've come together with the global typology at these biome scales, but then the IVC and the NVC drill down all the way to, in this case, just showing the group, but we do go all the way down to the association. And you can see we're tracking these units by subnation. I call them that because we're tracking them both in Canada and the US. So we have good subnational distribution information. And we're starting to assess and map them. So here again, looking at these ecosystems from a global scale, here is the temperate forest biome and the 4 major formations, including the oceanic cool temperate rainforest. So we can map these biomes comprehensively in North America. And then we can continue to drill down within North America to the group level. That's a very attainable national mapping standard. And you can see here we can start to cover the area occupied by these groups and begin to think about their conservation status. So this is the power of the nested hierarchy, where we can look at these types in multiple scales. We can take a global view, a regional view, and ultimately working with our state and provincial territorial partners, we can go right down to the state subnational levels. So this collaboration of the USNVC with the IVC and the global typology really gives us the ability to on the one hand, work with a compatible structure for the hierarchy, to assess global patterns using the global typology, but then to add the depth that we much need to do our conservation work at these continental to local patterns. So we hope this work will foster an international collaboration. Certainly here in the US, we're working closely with our Canadian partners. We would like to expand that also south of the border. So that's the big picture. Getting back to some of the details then, how are we describing these types? We've long had in place already through the first standard, version 1.0, a standard template that's guided how we compile descriptions. These are fairly detailed descriptions. They describe the vegetation, but also the environment, the dynamics, the distribution, and the geographic range of these types. So that common template has guided the structure of our databases. And so you can go on the websites for usnvc.org. It's also available through NatureServe Explorer and find these descriptions so that for any given type, you can pull up the description. If you're just interested in cruising through the hierarchy, you can simply click on the classification structure and work your way down to the various levels of interest. So these descriptions provide a lot of the meat as to what characterizes these ecosystems and how they function. One of the unique things about the vegetation standard is that it has a built-in dynamic content to it. The other federal standards have published the classification, and to change the classification requires changing the actual standard. We did that in version 1.0 and learned that we're still learning so much about vegetation that to fix it in time is not a good idea. And so the standard itself describes a process for peer review. So the goal is to make sure that we create a dynamic content standard for all vegetation types. So ongoing improvement of the USNVC is possible based on new information and analyses, and is assessed through a peer review process that's maintained by the Ecological Society of America's Vegetation Panel. The goal then is that as we get new information, ideally it's plot-based, and it's stored in databases and ultimately archived in a database we call VegBank, that we can use quantitative data to improve the NVC. But the key is that users always need to know what the status of the classification is at a given time. And so our websites, and the USNVC.org website in particular, is the authoritative standard place to find the information. That said, it's very challenging for people to use a classification that on any given week, there's a new version out. So we are looking to version more broadly the classification so that there is a stability to it, even as we're constantly refining it. So with the release of version 3.0, we plan to essentially stabilize the types for a time, much like you would do for a flora. Doesn't mean that the review process doesn't continue, as we all know from floras, but that there would be a periodic release that would track what had been changed so that users of an old version could link to the new. So as we think about improving the NVC, we want to do it through field sampling and through peer review. Ideally, plots are collected, they're compiled, analyzed, used to assess how well the current types capture those patterns, and then propose updates as needed. So behind the curtain, this panel, I'm going to pull it back. This is the current panel. I'm serving as editor-in-chief currently, but we have, most importantly, regional editors from around the country who know the vegetation at the level of the region and individual states. They're the ones who actually assess changes that affect types under their jurisdiction. And we have editors from across the border in Canada when types in the US extend into those regions. Certainly, for example, the Pacific coastal rainforest extends up and down the coast. The boreal and the Arctic or Alaska are shared with Canada. And so we want to maintain a range-wide perspective, even though we are jurisdictionally focused. So that's our panel. And with that, I will turn it over to Patrick to talk about some of the ways the NVC is being used.
All right. Hi, folks. Guess Maura will let me know if anything looks off and if folks are having issues hearing me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I tend to work a little bit more on the applied side. How can we use the NVC to inform conservation management, try and make more informed decisions? So I'll go through a few examples here. On the application side, I'll have a bit on ecosystem mapping and our current efforts to map the NVC at the group level. One of the core pieces that underpins applications of the NVC are conservation status ranks. And those are pictured in the upper right there. We have nature served conservation status ranks, going from ecosystems that are, we call them presumed extinct, to secure. These correspond closely with the more recent IUCN Red List of Ecosystem categories, where they're described from collapsed, various levels of, at risk to least concern. We also are involved in, guiding and using the NVC and ecological integrity and conditions assessments. These can be both on the ground using field data, or more and more using remote sensed data or combinations of remote sensed and field data. The NVC can provide a starting point or launch point for basic information on restoration, including preliminary target lists of species and basic conditions. Sorry, I have some wildlife outside my window right now. An alligator lizard crawling up the wall. That are a starting point, to be informed by more regional on-the-ground information, but provide some of that basic information on what comprises a particular ecosystem. I'll show a little bit on climate vulnerability modeling that we're involved in. One of the key pieces of the NVC, and in my opinion, is that it really provides a common ground for communication and reporting. We say that the NVC is a standard, and we recognize that folks in different places, different agencies, different geographies are using different vegetation classification systems. So perhaps you work with the BLM and the NRCS and you're using ecological site descriptions, or the Forest Service, they have forest type descriptions. Nonetheless, you can crosswalk these to put them in a common framework. And so you can say, as somebody working with the BLM and somebody working with the Forest Service, right, we're both managing southern ponderosa pine savanna, a particular group that occurs in this area, and we can, provide a kind of official reporting on acreages and so forth. So making sure that you're talking and reporting on the same general types of ecosystems. And I'll provide today a little bit of an example from Nevada on the use of the NVC and land management and planning for a state wildlife action plan example. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some examples of at-risk ecosystem assessment. These come from NatureServe's Biodiversity in Focus report from 2022. What we're looking at here on the left, you see a heat map where darker blues show a higher number of ecosystems in an individual state. Here we're looking at NVC groups. And you can see some, expected patterns. Large states that are floristically diverse, such as Texas and California, have, you can see the highest number of ecosystems. And in contrast, if you look at the right side of the graph, we're looking at percentages of states with at-risk ecosystems. So those that are ranked vulnerable or at risk of collapse. And you can see here, the states in the Great Plains showing up a lot. And this is due to, in large part, the conversion of land use in these areas, showing these ecosystems in these areas tend to be at high risk from agriculture development and are being lost relative to other states that may have more intact, somewhat more intact landscapes. Here you can see a more nuanced version of the location of at-risk ecosystems shown in red here. And you can see the patterns that underlie that. And again, this corresponds, you can see some patterns here, ecosystems along, coastal areas subject to development on the West Coast and also threatened by some other factors highlight prominently. And again, you have the Great Plains area showing up, with a lot of at-risk ecosystems that are still present. The areas in gray are those areas that are developed agricultural ruderal vegetation. So in large part, natural vegetation has been lost in some of those areas already. One interesting application of the NVC that we're working on is, how do you know what NVC group or macro group you're in? We're working with the US Forest Service and their amazing forest inventory and analysis program to develop keys to all forest macro groups and groups in the US. We anticipate this to be completed at the end of this next year. And here you can just see an example. We have a narrative key, but underpinning this is a computerized program that translates things like what ecological region is a plot located in? What are the dominant species? What's the relative cover of that species? In addition, where we have understory data, we can bring that in, all to try and identify in this case, whether a forest plot falls in, say, Colorado pinyon juniper, or maybe it's a longleaf pine plot in the southeast, or California deciduous woodland on the west coast. An example of the use of the NVC in state wildlife action plans. A couple years back, we worked with the state of Nevada, focusing on climate vulnerability assessments for wildlife habitats. And Nevada, like some other states doing wildlife action plans, they have their own categories. In this case, they had a broad pinyon juniper woodland category, which corresponds to a couple of NVC types that occur in the state. Great Basin pinyon juniper woodland being the dominant type, as well as a Columbia Plateau western juniper woodland and savanna that comes in the northwestern part of the state, primarily. You can see kind of the range-wide distribution of that Great Basin PJ type that corresponds to most of the state, and then a close-up of the distribution of that in Nevada. And the colors here show relative climate vulnerability, with darker blues being less vulnerable and lighter colors being more vulnerable in terms of a climate assessment that we've done. And I'll show just a little bit more about that. But underpinning this is the ability to take broad categories such as pinyon juniper woodland, perhaps desert shrubland, montane coniferous forest, crosswalk those to NVC types and use the NVC information and assessments that we may already have in hand for things like climate vulnerability to inform state wildlife action plans. This table we're looking at, this shows statewide, but I believe the managers in Nevada are using kind of regional assessments of this to help inform their planning. I've just highlighted a few things from our climate vulnerability reporting. We have an overhaul percentage at the top, suggesting that pinyon juniper in the state, 33% of it is highly vulnerable to climate change. And we have a number of factors here that I won't go into, but the other one I have highlighted is landscape condition. So, this is driven by agriculture, dissection from roads, et cetera. And so Nevada being a less developed state, most of the landscape is more intact than other areas, say in contrast to the upper Midwest. Want to provide a little bit of information on how you can find some of these applications, as well as maps and data that NatureServe is producing with our partners. One of the key places to go for that is what we call NatureServe's Open Data Hub. You can see pictured here. And we will provide a copy of this presentation that'll include the link you see here. But on this page, you can go to find information, on other topics such as at-risk species, freshwater systems. But here we have ecosystems highlighted. You can find an effort that we're currently working on, a USNVC group map. Shown here is kind of a beta version. We call version 0.94. I think that's the current one we have. For production 1.0 release, we expect that to be out in February 2025. It's based on a crosswalk from the earlier ecological systems classification that Landfire currently uses. And then we've updated that from our crosswalk with additional expert review and regional updates from state partners. It's a 30-meter raster resolution, and I'll show in a moment, it's complemented by scalable hexagon distributions that we'll be sharing that show a kind of a range-wide distribution. And in this initial version of our NVC group map, we're really focusing not on the individual pixel-based distributions, but rather, can we get the overall distribution and concept of the group correct? So here's an example of the hex map. Here we're looking at Cascadian Oregon white oak conifer forest and woodland. This is a at-risk type in the Pacific Northwest that's categorized primarily by Oregon white oak or Gary oak. And you can see the distribution here on the right. You can see zoomed in, we have these are 7 square mile hexagons, but we use nested hexagon framework, which is more commonly used these days. So we can scale up and down in terms of those. But here you're looking also at a heat map, which shows the number of hectares present for the ecosystem type in the map, ranging from very trace amounts to over 500 hectares in each of those hexes. So we're trying to focus on this level of accuracy rather than those individual 30-meter pixels, which are likely going to be more accurate from state, regional, and local mapping efforts. A little bit about our habitat climate vulnerability assessments. I showed a map that was of work that we had previously done that the state of Nevada utilized to inform their SWAP and try and provide some information about wildlife associated in that case with pinyon juniper woodlands and whether climate change might be a threat to those habitats. What we're showing here, this comes from our open data portal, is simply the footprint for over 100 ecosystem types that NatureServe has done climate change assessments for. In some areas, we might have assessed multiple ecosystem types at an individual location. So we're kind of showing the average across those types. But we've got measures for climate exposure, how much climate is changing directly, measures of landscape resilience, how fractured is the ecosystem, and where we have it, information on sensitivity, such as the abundance of invasive species like invasive brome grasses in arid Western systems. So our big release, a little bit of an overview here of USNVC 3.0. We're expecting a kind of a media release and some pushes, so you'll get some information probably around February of 2025 coming from the ESA panel and the USNVC website. We'll have a user guide focused on the macro group level, providing basic overviews of distribution, common species, some representative photos, etc. Regional reports, keys, highlighting keys that we have, such as that FIA key to forests and woodlands for Forest Service plots, as well as other key efforts we have. Don may have more to add here, and there'll be a publication showing, outlining that both the eco-veg approach and the alignment with the IUCN global ecosystem typology. Don, do you want to add some?
No, that's good. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Don has been answering questions as you've been putting them in. So I don't have any questions pending right now, but if you have some, please feel free to post them in Q&A. We have plenty of time. It's 12:37, so we've got plenty of time until 1 o'clock. But, I'd be actually interested, I know you're just getting to 3.0 and all you can see is getting that out and ready for everybody. But do you have any opportunities to share maybe what you think 4.0, 5.0, what might be on the roadmap going forward?
Wow.
See what happens when we don't have other questions?
Well, me, Patrick, and I both have different answers or different parts to answer that. But for me, 4.0 would be heavily based on plot information systematically collected across the range of types, so that we're able to better characterize both the vegetation, the soils, and other ecological drivers of the types. That's not going to happen in version 3.0. The other part of it is we've worked very closely with state programs over the last 10 years to ensure that the types are listed accurately for their state if they're using the NVC directly. But if they have a state classification, we work closely to develop a crosswalk so that any state type can be linked to the NVC. That opens up a lot of information about the knowledge states have as to where the best examples of types are and where rare types are. So we would hope by the time version 4.0 comes around that we would be reporting more detailed information about the types, with that data.
Patrick, did you have another response?
Just to complement what Don mentioned, I think in a broad sense, the 3.0 focuses on things down to the group level, in terms of the revisions that we made, and then placing the finer level things that land managers are often interested in, associations and alliances, at a local scale, in the right groups. But going back to that level with plot data, backing that up, the I'll say the USNVC is currently trying to reinvest in our plot management system and hoping to make that more user friendly. So it's more of an accessible standard where you can put things in and access plot data that underlies the NVC. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got a couple questions that have come in, and yes, we can share the typed answers. When we share the recording, we will put all the resources available on the description page of the link. So how are novel ecosystems included in this classification?
They're included in various ways. Where the novel ecosystem is derived from a cleared natural stand, for example, old fields, whether herbaceous or even old field forests, if you mature long enough, they are included within the natural ecosystem, broadly defined, but they're typically separated out at the mid-levels because their composition begins to diverge from more natural stands. They tend to have a lot of exotics. If they have natives, they're often the gentlest, most stress-tolerant natives. And the soil features, particularly if it's been a plowed or developed site, those features are so different from natural ones that they would fall out at the mid-level. But we do want to catalog them. They can be important natural habitat, broadly defined. They certainly provide some level of ecosystem functions. And so because the NVC covers the entire landscape, we do assess them and try to build them into the classification.
Okay. So somebody actually mentioned that they'd like to hear more about the answer to Matthew Struckoff's question about EDS and USNVC's collaboration.
The ESDs, the ecological site
ESDs,
designs? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I can mention a little bit about that. So folks from NRCS reached out to us, primarily around, I think, looking at some ways of grouping ecological site descriptions, this concept of ecological site groups, with sort of maybe some parallels between the NVC, like at the group level versus the alliance level, with ecological site descriptions being more at the kind of alliance and association levels, particular combinations of soil supporting vegetation types, and a desire to have broader soil vegetation characterizations, things like maybe deeper loam soils versus sandy, with pinyon juniper versus sandy rocky outcrops or clay soils, things like that. And sorry, I'm a plant ecologist who does a bit of soils, mostly through plants, rather than a soils ecologist. But I think there's potential to be more alignment at this, at this higher level of ecological site groups, and what say groups, macro groups, and alliances might correspond to ecological site groups and ecological site descriptions that are out there now. So it's early days, but we're at the table and part of the conversation on that. Don?
Yeah, I think that's right on. And sometimes when I talk with the NVC, we have an intro slide where we talk about the different perspectives that ecologists take on ecosystems. And one is sort of the bioecosystem approach that the USNVC represents, where vegetation and the abiotic factors are linked together. The other is a site perspective. It's more driven by the abiotic, but insofar as it reflects vegetation. And then there's sort of the landscape view, the ecoregional approach. And all three views together get at the ecosystem, and depending on your need, you want to work the one as primary and then rely on the others. And that's our hope with the NVC, is that it is a primary tool for tracking the changing landscape of where ecosystems occur, but it also needs the ecological sites to be able to predict where you might want to restore an ecosystem. So we're hoping that by these collaborations, we can strengthen each other's work.
Also, I just want to mention, if you're not monitoring chat, there are people adding additional comments to collaborate and add on to the answers that are being given by our presenters as well. So we will make sure that that information is saved. How is agricultural land categorized in the NVC? Or is it
I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, Don. I mean, we have it's broad agricultural categories that we have similar to the national, land cover data set. We do break out things in the rural area, but agriculture is separated into things like row crops versus orchards and plantations. So
at one point we were working with NRCS and some other groups who did more with agricultural lands classification to refine the other levels of the cultural part, the intensively managed part of the classification. And we still have some of that in place. On the plantation side, we've done the most work because the U.S. Forest Service FIA program tracks all forests, whether they're Norway spruce plantations or they're bald cypress swamps. And so we needed to be sure to have those types. And so the plantation part of the agricultural side is the most developed. Currently, we can classify any plantation stand for you into the NVC. It gets a little less clear with pasture and hay fields or the horticultural crops. But in principle, the levels are there for users to go all the way down to tulip fields if they're in Holland. Don't have much of those. Actually, we have a lot of those in the West Coast. So they are trackable, but it's not a very actively used part of the classification.
Okay.
Yeah, I will add that I think we're seeing a bit more of a need for characterization of landscapes, and there was a question on like urbanized and urbanized, and I think agriculture relates to that in terms of efforts for biodiversity accounting and reporting, where you might have your classic let's say corn and soy versus something that is a smaller agricultural field that might have pollinator plantings, and how do you incorporate those types of things into landscape mapping and assessments, and I think we're just starting to tackle some of those things now.
So somewhat related to that is a question thinking about a protection layer that focuses on opportunities on private lands for conservation easements. Does this exist?
That's a good question. I want to say that we have a lot of the information to help tackle that, both from ecosystem and biodiversity and species level biodiversity. And we have, in some cases, maps at the group level that you can combine with your private land and your protected area databases. And we commonly do analyses around that. I don't know that we've explicitly identified, conservation opportunities, but we have things like our ecosystem endangerment map combined with our map of biodiversity importance, which is a stacked layer of over 2,000 distribution models for individual at-risk species that provides, so that in combination with your ecosystem ecosystem endangerment and condition can contribute to that conversation very strongly. So.
And there have been efforts to take our developing the group maps that are still in development, to overlay them on our protected areas data layer and to determine which groups are in need of protection, and then weighting those by those that are most at risk as well. USGS, the Gap Analysis Program, has had some interest in doing that. The trick is always to get down to a level where you trust the map versus what's on the ground, so that you actually making protection decisions, what's really there as opposed to what's been modeled to be there. And so that's that back and forth you really need to have with, state programs and field staff to sort of make sure we marry the modeling with the field data.
Yeah.
Speaking of maps, someone asked, is there access to any of these maps that you used in your presentation?
Yes, so there's access to our what we're kind of calling our beta version of the USNVC map. You can go to that biodiversity NatureServe's open data portal, which I had a slide on, and we'll share this slide with a link to that. And you can get our map, you can get climate change information, you can find some links to a lot of other resources that NatureServe has. We are working closely with some state partners who are engaged in things like swap efforts. We're engaged in the Midwestern swap effort, coordinating among states there, and providing initial access to our, kind of an initial map, and trying to figure out where we can plug in our more, 1.0 version once that comes along. So.
And can you describe the how plot survey methodology or point to a document? And so what is your plot survey methodology, and how do your methods differ terrestrial versus freshwater, shore, and wetland sites? And it looks like, Don, you're starting to type an answer to that. Do you want to?
I was about to, but I can answer it. We do have some documents, and I could send them by email if the person wants to contact me.
Okay.
There's some of the state, and also it would depend on what state they're in too. So if they want to dovetail with how the state program is collecting data, then it might be important to know which state, because plot survey methodology varies just enough. And ultimately, if you want to manage your data in a plot database with partners, working locally might be important. We don't really differ in the methodology between the main terrestrial types and wetlands. It's essentially the same methodology. Certainly when wetland sites are linear, the plot methodology is adapted to that. So, but it's essentially a shared methodology.
Okay. And approximately how many new associations will be in 3.0 compared to the last release? And are there any patterns in global rarity with new associations? Are a lot of the new associations G1 to G3 or G4 to G5?
Well, it's a tricky question to answer because, well, what we could do is go back to 2016 when we released, the version 2.0, and somewhere in my files I have the number. I would say if I was just picking a number, there's at least 500 new associations. There were about 6,000 or so. And now here it is 8 years later, there's about at least 500 more. That was the first part of the question. What was the second part of the question?
I lost it. are there any new patterns in global rarity with new associations? Are a lot of the new associations G1 to G3 or G4 or G5?
It's, I would say it's not so much about the rarity. It's as much about, for example, California did not really have a list of associations back in 2016. I mean, it was work in progress. They've made much more progress now, and it's not so much about rarity as level of inventory.
Okay.
Same with Alaska. So, yeah, I don't think there's much of a relationship there.
Okay. And back, since we're talking about associations, how often is the association level used, and do those go through a process to be accepted? And is there a general minimum size?
The association level historically was the main level that we focused on. So it's gotten a lot of use over the years. But with the release of version 2.0, especially in 2016, and now with version 3.0, many more levels are in play. And as you saw with the group maps, it's very hard to map associations nationally, so it would never be a national product, whereas the group can be. So I would say the association is probably less a target level than it used to be. And again, I'm sorry, but I lost the second part of the question.
No worries, no worries. So we are getting close to the top of the hour. Patrick and Don have generously agreed to stay on so that we can answer all the questions that have currently been posted. If you can stay with us and would like to listen live, that's great. But if you need to drop at the top of the hour, the recording will include these answers. So we'll go ahead and just go through the rest of the questions. Does the classification system address restored ecosystems, and at what level?
I can take a part of that, Patrick, but you can weigh in too. Well, it does address restored ecosystems, but it will always depend on what the restoration plan is. Insofar as the restoration plan is attempting to restore something to a natural ecosystem, the target would be the natural ecosystem that's already in the classification, and it would be a level of a matter of tracking progress towards that. It may start off as a rural ecosystem. Many wetland restorations get pretty weedy initially, and then only if they're tended to will they ultimately become more natural. So it may start off rural and then become natural. And certainly that's where the classification can track those stages. But restoration can mean a lot of things. There's a lot of pollinator meadows out there on the landscape these days. They are a mixed bag of composition and structure. So they could end up in various places in the classification too. So yeah, there's no one answer to that question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have two that I think are probably pretty specific, and I'll talk about them and then encourage Helen and Rhea to reach out to you both to talk about these things more individually. Because Helen says we've collected plot-based data, about 1,200 in New York City terrestrial upland forests and polystrene wetlands characterizing about 10,000 acres, and love to talk about contributing to urban data. So Patrick, Don, that's just really more to let you know about that. And Helen, encourage you to follow up. And then Rhea has a question that is detailed about Colorado and assigning associations. So again, I'll just encourage you to reach out to ask them your question directly. Do you plan to assess the changes in conservation profiles when underlying vegetation maps do you plan to assess the changes in conservation profiles when the underlying vegetation maps potentially change?
So by conservation profile, I presume they mean our G ranks and S ranks, so the conservation status assessment. If so, we're always refining our ranks as we get new data in. The ranks ultimately are not just based on the maps; they're based on field data collected by programs. knowledge about the drivers that affect these ecosystems. But insofar as, the map was used, for example, the range extent or the area occupied, if that changed, we would certainly want to reassess the rank. Um, on the species side, our goal is to make sure the ranks are current and reviewed every 10 years. Whether we can aspire to that on the ecosystem side remains to be determined, but it would be a nice goal.
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely something we would like to do. I mean, we have a lot of estimates of the, say, current distribution versus a historical estimate. But when it comes to estimating, say, recent loss, which is really important in conservation assessments, that can be tricky because the mapping methods and accuracy can be worlds apart. So, you do the best you can, but a map from 20 years ago compared to a map today, it can be hard to get at the extent of change in the system versus what's changed in our mapping accuracy and methods. So it's something we try and stay up on top of, but I think it's a challenging area. So.
Moira, there was a question relating to a comment from George Gann,
Mm-hmm.
which I did find about
Oh, good. Okay, great.
how to handle degraded plots and sites, which comes up a lot. So I just wanted to speak to it if that's okay.
Great. That'd be great.
Yeah, so George asked, that you noted that plots can be in various states of degradation from major to minor, and how are the data from degraded conditions filtered out so as not to creep into the USNVC? So it's not so much a matter of creeping in. We want them to creep in. But the trick is, how do you handle what you consider to be a degraded natural type versus a novel type? So, examples, a simple example would be, a natural marsh that is overtaken by Phragmites. At some point, there's no going back without nuking the site. So at some point, we're going to flip that type from a natural cattail or bulrush marsh to a novel Phragmites exotic type. What we do when the stand is sort of partially invaded by Phragmites, but still has native components, is we would continue to track it as the native type. From a classification perspective, it is common sometimes to on the one hand, drop out the plots initially that have more degradation evident in them, focus on the natural condition, and then bring in the degraded plots to see, are they still connecting to the natural type or have they flipped into a novel? So you can actually quantitatively derive that transition.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for addressing that. We have just a couple of questions left. Where can we learn more about vegetation data collection to support USNVC's efforts with classification in south of the border?
South of the border. Patrick, you're often south of the border.
There is. So it's a little bit of a tricky question currently. NatureServe used to have a formal partnership with conservation organizations throughout Latin America. But in a reorganization of our network several years ago, we refocused our official area of expertise primarily to the US and Canada. So we still collaborate a bit with organizations in Latin America, some of the Pronaturas and Canabio in Mexico, but it's not as direct as it used to be, I'd say. In terms with the global ecosystem typology out and coming off of the conference on parties, what a horrible name that is, the COP meetings on biodiversity. I think some of the IUCN red list path is potentially the stronger pathway currently, since that's used for global reporting. I mean, the US isn't officially, a signatory and using that framework as much directly, but other countries are using it more. So I think the, IVC and NVC methods getting down to the lower levels can help support, other countries working to flush out those lower levels of the hierarchy.
Okay, so is this entirely science or fact-based, or is any of the classification political? Meaning, are you asked to classify something in a certain way rather than just the physical attributes? Somebody wants a land to be a prairie versus an old agricultural field being restored.
That's a great question. We tend not to engage so much in that level, but I think it very much does come up for practitioners who are, say, trying to assign things to the NVC. We are engaging a bit more on, things with, biodiversity assessments and corporate biodiversity reporting. So we do have a framework out there, our ecological integrity assessment framework. And I don't know if Don, you want to, maybe we can share a link to that in the materials we provide. But that does provide condition assessments, say from A to D, using some standard approaches. Say, does a forest ecosystem have or a group have multiple levels of canopy? Does it have at least a certain percentage of native versus non-native cover, et cetera? So we have some standards like that that can be used to support that, but it is a tricky thing when you're doing either field or field and remote assessments. Where are those lines? So.
Okay. The last question is Nels Barrett's question about the new functional eco-veg assignments, but I thought we kind of dealt with that when we were talking about soils, but can you both look at that question and see if you feel like there's something that was left unanswered there?
Yeah, the ecological systems land fire approach has identified BPS, the biophysical setting units. There's something like ecological site groups that Patrick mentioned earlier. So insofar as we can link ecological site groups to the land fire biophysical setting, and both of those can be characterized in terms of the NVC types on them, we kind of have a happy relationship. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for addressing that. So I think we've worked through our questions. Thank you so much. Thanks to those of you who hung in there with us all the way to the end. As I said, you will be receiving a recording of all of this. I know Patrick and Don have mentioned a couple links they'll be happy to share. We'll make sure we include all of that, the chat, the Q&A, and all of those will be included as resources. And I believe they also agreed to send a PDF of their PowerPoint if I remind them. So, and I'll do so. So there we go. So thank you so much for joining us today, everyone in our audience. And of course, Patrick and Don, thank you so much. This is exciting work, and we really appreciate all the effort that's going into it from NatureServe. Thank you.
Thank
you.
you.
Right, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we're going to call it a day for today. So we hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you so much.